Hello, I'm Kathryn Lowerre, and there should have been a very old tech handout which was distributed to some of you, and otherwise there was, I believe, a pile at the back of the room. I will be referring to it, speaking of finding interesting things in collections. As Cindy said, I'm a musicologist. I work on music in the London theaters, and I teach at a College of Music which only recently separated from its former home in the College of Arts and Letters. I'm bringing to the panel experiences, of course, from my own teaching and research, including projects used by my graduate seminar on music in London in the 18th century. Now, of course, there are enormous advantages to having access to electronic facsimile collections like ECCO and EBO, as well as journal archives like JSTOR, particularly for scholars who work and teach at institutions with limited special collections and some geographic restrictions. I will say the special collections at Michigan State is wonderful for comic books and American popular culture and the history of activism in agriculture. It is not so wonderful if you work on 17th and 18th century England. However, as the proposed title suggests, my endorsement of electronic materials, as we've already heard from previous speakers, comes with a certain number of caveats. Just as students can now mindlessly download and cite outdated journal articles from the 1870s, my favorite was the Choral Conductor's Circular on Handel's Oratorios, 1884. People have done a little work on Handel since 1884. Through JSTOR, the use of electronic facsimiles, of course often based on existing microfilm collections, can warp our perception of 18th century materials. I will say, as a musicologist, EBO generally does not scan music items, and ECCO's printed music files are exceedingly limited. In the ECCO collection, songs is usually only a collection of texts. I will also note that the English focus of ECCO means, for example, there is virtually nothing on Mozart, since he was not really a figure of any interest in 18th century England. I find considerable value, however, in using facsimiles with students at all levels, particularly music grad students. While they are often experts about their own instrument or instruments, they often lack a sense of history. Facsimiles of 18th century music and music-related publications, and I've given you some examples on your handout, show clear differences from modern music editions and the sanitized historical anthologies, which are often students' only visual experience of 18th century music. I have given you an example of a more popular, obviously, print, The Dancing Master, which is often referred to, and a deliberately somewhat grubby example of Francesco Gemignani. This is an example of, for those of you who are familiar with the modern publication of music, the difference between looking at music printed in score with all of the parts versus music printed in separate parts, which then often has to be either played through or assembled in order to see whether and errors corrected. And of course, there are often many errors. Copy editing was not perfect in the 18th century any more than it is now. So the opportunity for students to work with facsimiles of original sources benefits them in other ways, as well as, getting a sense of history, admittedly a mediated sense of history, as our past speaker said. Instead of simply reading scholars' works summarizing a decades-long series of famous 18th century concerts, the concerts of ancient music, and this is on the back of your handout, just one example of that, students can study the original concert programs, including lists of performers and patrons, and independently evaluate the conclusions reached by music historians while they immerse themselves in the culture of 18th century performing life in London. Some of the things that appeal about electronic resources in my scholarly work are the same things that appeal to my students. They're more readily accessible where I am, more efficient to pull up than microfilm, which is also incomplete at my university library. I can follow up on connections and check hunches and save PDF versions. However, they do not, of course, always preserve the first, best, or most useful edition of a source, particularly in the case of some plays which were frequently republished, while some collections transcribe plays without including the front matter, all of that messy, unimportant details like the dedicatory letter and who said what to whom, the assumption is that you're interested in the play text and not in all that theater history detail, which is, of course, precisely what I'm interested in. There are already, of course, been two topics mentioned that I would very happy to discuss further. One of them, of course, is the limitations of keyword searching, and another one is the use of electronic journals. There is a wonderful example in the Journal of 17th Century Music, which overlaps into the 18th century with a reasonable amount of frequency, and I think is a wonderful example of, again, the advantages of journals which can include musical clips, not just printed music, and video clips, which, of course, if you are reading or assigning students to read a scholarly article on Baroque dance and are not lucky enough to be at a university which has a dance historian on faculty, are really quite wonderful. So I look forward to the rest of our discussion.